My ex-boyfriend is very sensitive about his intelligence. Until I saw what he kept in the basement, I might have been able to move past that insecurity. Before I tell my tale, I want you to know that I'm smart. I only mention that for the sake of context. That was the first time I ever admitted it. Anyway, Matteo took me out for dinner on our half anniversary. An act of romance. And now I see it for just that. An act. Performative kindness. Smithy and I were reminiscing on university. You remember Smithy, right? Anyway, he was talking about you being too smart for me. How funny is that? I'm a lab technician. And you? Well, you teach high school science, Matthew smirked. My eyes widened. Wow. Wow. Don't take it personally. You just weren't cut out for the laboratory. And that's fine, Sonia, Matteo said. But I'm definitely smarter. I received a first-class degree. So did I replied, seething. Not only that, I was awarded top-performing graduating student. That's why Smithy was making the joke. If you'd actually bothered to turn up to the graduation ceremony, you would have known that. The man was stunned, but that wounded reaction morphed into fury. So what? I don't care about a score that you received 3 years ago, Sonia, he growled, eyes swelling with tears that seemed sorrowful and ferocious in equal measure. I sighed. I just want to go to bed. We'll talk about it in the... Sonia! A familiar voice bellowed. I twisted around to face Keith Dawson, the chemistry teacher from sixth form. His scraggly hair was greyer than I remembered, and he was standing beside a tall woman. Keith, I replied, grateful to see anything other than my boyfriend's vile face. This is my wife, Martina, he said. The elderly man and his wife squeezed into our cosy booth. It was around 8:30 in the evening, and the tables were slowly starting to empty, but time flew by. We drank coffee and conversed. I was still deeply stung by Matteo's words, but I loved him. I loved who he'd been until that evening. Say, how would you two fancy accompanying us for a nightcap? Matteo asked Keith and Sonia. I live across the road. It's a 30-second walk. Keith looked at Martina, and she shrugged. He then cast his gaze to me. Would that be okay, Sonia? The kind man asked. I already sensed that you were just being polite by entertaining your old teacher and his wife this evening. I smiled. Keith, I'd be offended if you were to say no. As we relaxed into Matteo's flat, the memory of the argument started to flee my mind. Alcohol might have helped, of course. The four of us drank whiskey in the living room. We laughed and we cried. We discussed everything from the wonders of science to our favourite Love Island contestants. Right, it's 11 o'clock, Keith drunkenly slurred. And we're not as young as you crazy kids. You better head home. Where's Martina? She went to the toilet, I said. She'll be back. Yeah, that was about an hour ago, Keith pointed out, clearly struggling to think clearly. I'll go and check on her. Though I was also quite tipsy, I laughed as the inebriated man hobbled out of the room. Finding the moment too funny to forget, I immediately texted Tess, my oldest friend. I let her know that our high school teacher was stumbling around Matteo's house drunkenly. She didn't believe me, so I followed Keith into the hallway and snapped a piece of photographic evidence. Flesh in the Grape Tower! A distant voice screamed. The unexpected disjointed exclamation sent a shockwave of fear through my body. My phone jolted out of my hand and clattered to the floor. However, in my merry stupor, I didn't think to pick it up. I simply waddled forwards, chasing the source of the sound. In a grape tower! A muffled voice loudly giggled. There was something deeply disturbing about it. The inflections of the words felt wrong, as did the varying volume. It sounded so unnatural and confused. I realised that the noise was coming from the spare room, and I was baffled to find light spilling through the doorway. The door was always locked. Matteo claimed it had been locked since he started renting the place, and he also claimed that he hadn't bothered to ask the landlord for a key. Hello? I tipsily called. Are you a... The light clicked off. Possessed by an instinctive urge to run, I found myself staring into the surprisingly spacious room. Light illuminated various shelves and boxes. It was difficult to gauge how big the space might be. From the darkness, footsteps pattered across the floor. They ricocheted off the walls, coating my back with goosebumps. I felt fear in my heart, but my head was telling me that I had to keep going. Hello? I called a second time. Give and give. Think. That disjointed voice wailed. That was when I saw her. The woman in the corner. A haunting, shadowy spectre swayed listlessly at the end of the basement. Her form was dimly outlined by the streetlight pouring through the window. She was facing the wall and murmuring something. "Are you okay, Martina?" I asked. The woman stopped swaying so suddenly that my heart halted. She began to twitch, violently. Guided by the streetlight, I stumbled towards the woman. Tripping over various boxes and bags, I slowly neared her, and I started to distinguish bodily features. For starters, it wasn't Martina. The woman was far too short. When I was close enough, I delicately placed a hand on the stranger's shoulder. The twitching slowed, as did her breathing. And then, at a glacial pace, her neck turned. Like a clockwork doll, her joints clicked and ached, as if she were being wound up for the first time in an age. "Are you okay, miss?" I quietly asked. The light caught her face, and I hurled. The woman's forehead was caving inwards, as if it were a deflated football. Skin sealed the horrific slope, but it appeared to have been haphazardly stitched into place. Her eyes were glazed, as if she were no longer able to register the world around her, and drool dripped from her ever-parted, ever-trembling lips. Yes, it has to be a thing," she jabbered nonsensically. Without warning, her hand gripped my upper arm in a vice-like hold. "Never mind! Towers! Okay, Mum!" she said, unleashing a hoarse cry. "I'm going to get help," I shivered, prying her strong fingers from my arm. Before the damaged woman could injure me again, whether intentionally or not, I twisted to flee the room, and a warm wave of panic immediately drenched my face. There was a black silhouette in the doorway. "Sleep well, Sonia," Matteo whispered, and then the black shape of a man disappeared into the darkness before me. Blind to his whereabouts, I fearfully tried to raise my hands in defense, but darkness followed a blunt, excruciating blow to the head. When I woke, my eyesight was blurry. My head felt as if it was split down the center. As I wrestled my eyelids farther apart, however, my mind started to wake. I realized I was eyeing a blindingly white surgical light above me, and when I looked away, my vision began to adjust. I was lying on an operating table in the middle of a grey, soundproofed box room, possibly only 8 by 8 feet. There were red stains on the walls. Some were fresher than others. As the ringing in my pulsating ears started to lessen, I became aware of moans. So, I lifted my head, which was a dreadful idea for 2 reasons. It was immensely painful, and it revealed a nightmarish sight. Sitting in a neat row against the wall, there were 3 women. Each of them had foreheads caved inwards, though some deformities were less prominent than others. Their eyes were lazily surveying the room, and their mouths gaped. But what broke me was the girl rocking on her legs. I recognized her. "Chloe?" I breathlessly whimpered. The girl's eyes didn't meet mine. She was staring at the wall with the same vacant expression as the other women. "Make it better," she said. Her voice was full of jarring inflections and volume shifts, and I started to sob, remembering the girl I'd known at university. A girl who had been so bright, so full of life. "What happened to you?" I cried. Following a series of sudden thunderous footsteps, the door opened, and peering through it, I saw a familiar narrow window. A spare room lay beyond the grey, padded, blood-stained box. Matteo had hidden a prison of horror in his flat. How many nights did I spend above those poor mutilated women? "Ah, you're awake," he said. The malicious man was carrying a squirming body over his shoulder, and he placed her beside the other 3 women. It was the lady I'd first seen in the basement. "Matteo!" I croaked, wriggling in my restraints. "Please!" "I was just preparing some dinner for you ladies," Matteo said, ignoring me. The man shuffled around the cramped room and handed each of the women a separate place. "It's a British roast. Food? You've seen food before, silly girls," he chuckled, whilst helping each of them out. "What's wrong?" Is it the meat? Is it a little tougher than usual? Matteo, I sobbed. Well, I've got a secret, the man whispered, continuing to dismiss me. It's a different cut of meat. A slightly older meat. Matteo paused, and he finally locked his eyes onto mine. They were unhinged, much like the unsavoury smile beneath, and, as I carefully inspected the food, I started to piece together the terrible turn of events. The bloody plates. The toughness of the meat. Where's Martina? Where's Keith? I whimpered. The man smiled coldly. There wasn't room for them, Sonia, but there's room for you. Matteo began to unload the contents of a tool bag, revealing an assortment of surgical instruments, and I started to scream. Why are you crying? He asked. I heavily implied that I wouldn't ever let them eat you, Sonia. There, I stated it plainly. Honestly, I thought you were smart. The man crouched down, and he grabbed Chloe's limp lobotomized head in his hands. He placed a kiss on her caved forehead. Though it was less pronounced than the disfigurement of the two women beside her, it was no less horrifying. I could see the lifeless look in her eyes, the drool on her chin. Worst of all, I could hear the words from her lips. Potatoes, she whispered, before groaning painfully. Matteo laughed sinisterly. Yes, clever girl, well done. They are potatoes. You're starting to understand. I'm sorry for upsetting you, I sobbed. Just let me go, Matteo. You don't have to do this. It's only a small procedure, Sonia. You won't feel a thing. Well, you won't remember feeling a thing. You won't do much, actually. Life will be so much easier for you. We'll sit a physics test next week. Let's see who scores higher, he whispered. No, I moaned, watching Matteo remove the drill from the bag. Don't worry. I've vastly improved the procedure since Laurel. You met her. She was my first trial. But look at Chloe. She's no different, Matteo said. I cried in disbelief. She's not Chloe anymore. She's not intelligent, Matteo finished, smiling. I've freed her of that burden, and I'll free you too. As the drill started to whir, I screamed in terror. My mind braced for the horror of surviving as an unthinking shell. But as the inhuman man inched closer, a wailing noise sounded in the distance. Frowning at the sudden distraction, Matteo begrudgingly turned the drill off. It was a police siren. The man bared his menacing teeth, which no longer concealed his true malice. He looked stuck, unable to formulate a plan, but the siren neared at a rapid pace. My boyfriend finally decided to escape. The police officers missed him by a minute, and when they found us in the spare room, one of the responders vomited on the floor. Sending Tess the photo had saved my life. In my intoxicated state, I hadn't properly inspected the picture, but Tess noted Martina's bloody, unconscious body atop the kitchen table. The photo also revealed Matteo watching me from the shadowed corner of the kitchen. Whilst I searched the spare room, my murderous boyfriend apprehended Keith in the bathroom. Then, he attacked me. He clearly hadn't realised I sent the picture to someone. The 4 lobotomized women are currently living under supervised care. I visit Chloe frequently, but it's incredibly painful to do so. Such a small fragment of her remains, a damaged, incomprehensible fragment. None of her sentences make sense. I don't even know whether she exists painfully or happily. What terrifies me, above all other things, is the knowledge that Matteo is still out there.
To the man under my house, thank you. Thank you so much. I live in a small 1,100 square foot ranch-style home. I've lived here for 7 years and never had a complaint until just last year. My wife and I always joked that our home was haunted. Things were always moving around or disappearing completely from where they were left last. You have a terrible memory, my wife would say, blaming me when something went missing. When you lose something, it's just a ghost, but when I do, I'm an idiot? More than a few dumb arguments started because of these paranormal events that took place. My wife was convinced the ghost made its home in our basement, claiming that when she goes down to do laundry, it watches her. I can feel it, she tried to convince me. Didn't have any clue how close to right she was. It was a dark Sunday night, not just some it's getting late darkness, but an eerie, star-obscured pitch black. Our weekend was nearing a close and our sights had shifted to work the following morning. We couldn't have been less prepared for the impending chaos. My wife was lying on the couch, reading a book while completely under a blanket, one of her many lovable quirks. "I always did it as a kid, and it reminds me of being young," she told me with a smile, back when I first caught her doing it before we were married. I had been working on my laptop, preparing for a deadline that I had been underprepared for that upcoming week. From under the blanket, just a few feet away on the couch, I heard my wife's "I need you to do something" voice. "Sweetie?" I rubbed my eyes and looked over at the shifting blanket as she peeked out from underneath. "Yes?" "Will you get the laundry from the dryer?" I sighed. I knew she had scared herself with whatever she was reading and now wouldn't go down to the basement because of it. "Fine," I said, annoyed by the minor inconvenience but secretly glad to get away from my computer. "I love you." I could hear the words as they exited her smiling lips. "I love you too, goofball." I covered her face again with a blanket. I began to march to the basement, flicking on the light switch at the top of the stairs and slowly trudging down the creaking wooden steps. The basement has always been a good 10 or more degrees cooler than the rest of our home, a fact that didn't help to ease my wife's fear of being alone in it. It is completely unfinished with cement floors and exposed wooden beams in the walls. I had intended on finishing it when I had the money, but that day had yet to come. The dryer was off with a green light blinking, indicating a finished load. I pulled open the door and started heaving the clothes in large two-handed hugs into a basket. Before I had finished, I heard something pop, followed by the sound of wood hitting concrete. My heart jumped. As afraid as I was in the moment, I knew I couldn't justify my wife's fear of the damned souls looming in our basement. I gathered myself and then walked around a corner wall to another empty square room where the sound had originated from. Along an internal section of wall nearest the ceiling was a now open and dark tunnel-like space that was comprised of earth and, in some spots, support structures of the house. On the hard cement floor was a piece of wood that had covered the crawl space originally. How did this fall? I asked myself. I considered in that moment getting my hammer and nails to cover the space again, but as I stood in the small section of the basement that I had seldom visited, I felt something. I felt someone. The sensation of someone watching me was undeniable. I hadn't felt it during my previous visitations to the basement. However, in my wife's defense, she did the laundry far more often than I. I stood there motionless as I looked into the dark crawl space that I hadn't known existed. "Hello?" I called, hoping my wife wouldn't hear. "Ryan!" she called from upstairs, her voice muffled by the floorboards that separated us. She never used my name like that unless it was serious. I pried my eyes from the deep abyss and ran up the stairs as fast as my body would allow. "What's going on?" I said, panting and looking around the living room. The blanket on the couch was vacant now. "Sweetie, don't fuck with me. I could have tripped up those damn stairs." There was nothing. I never knew her to be a prankster, nor was she sneaky in any sense of the word. I made for our bedroom, which is nearest the rear of the home. The lights were off, and I hadn't had my phone on me. I walked inside and could only make out our messy bed illuminated by the light that barely crept in from the living room. Christina? It was then that they made themselves known. A man gripped my throat from behind me. I struggled as much as I could, the sheer surprise and terror coursing through my veins. He tightened his grip as I wrapped my fingers around the door frame. He had been directing our struggle into the hallway, and I wasn't going easily. When I thought I was finally shaking his grip loose, a second person approached us and rammed my head into the wall. I could feel the blood leaking down my face slowly. My vision was faded now, and motor skills had been dialed down to 2. They silently directed my body back to the basement stairs and tossed me down. Christina. I could barely even formulate her name with my lips as I stained the concrete with my blood. I tried to lift myself, but sent a shock of pain through my arm as I realized I had broken several fingers. I lifted my head and watched as 3 figures made their way down the basement stairs behind me. The last one had her in his arms. She was bound like a trophy deer and unable to speak through the duct tape that was wrapped several times around her head. Fuck you, I managed. They dropped her carelessly to the floor with a thud. I shook my head and felt tears filling my eyes. One of the men approached me and grabbed my leg before dragging me closer to her in the center of the basement. I tried to look into her eyes. They had hit her too hard and now she was barely conscious. "It's okay. You're gonna be alright," I mumbled quietly through my tears to her, unsure she could even hear me. Behind us, the 3 men had been gathered, silently whispering to one another as they pulled supplies out of a duffel bag. My strength had left me completely. I was sure that I had broken a leg as well as my fingers, and my head injury made comprehension of anything a difficult task. I shifted my hand that still had function up to my face and wiped away the blood and tears from my eyes. The men had dispersed and began making a shape on the ground around my wife and I with spray paint. They filled the room with odd rune-like symbols before lighting candles. "What is this?" I yelled through my pain. The men were unfazed and continued finishing up the process. I heard a muffled grumble coming from my side. I writhed over and saw her blinking back to consciousness. "Shh, it's okay," I said, broken-hearted and panicked. I watched tears fall from her cheeks onto the cold ground. A hard kick to my ribs pulled me out of the moment, and I could hear her whimpering through the tape. The men were laughing. The sadistic fucks laughed as they took turns kicking me and my wife as we lay helpless on the ground. I could hear her gasping for air, and suddenly none of my pain mattered. When they finally grew tired, I struggled to listen as they whispered something about sacrifice. I needed it to end, her suffering. I couldn't watch her in pain, choking and crying in a puddle of her own making. The flashbacks came as every story and movie predict. She was so beautiful the day we first met. Sarcastic but quick to apologize if she thought she offended you. She loved laughter and only lived to please the people around her, selfless and gentle. There was a change in the demeanor of our attackers, where before everything was a game to them, now they seemed much more serious. One of them approached Christina with a small knife in hand.
"Through pain, through suffering, we summon thee."
His voice spoke, breaking their long silence. I couldn't watch as he hunched down over her, silent tears falling from her eyes. "Please," I said, desperate for divine intervention. And then he came. From the corner basement room, a strange figure shambled into view. He then appeared to be gaunt and naked, but my blurry vision failed to harvest any detailed imagery. The men were transfixed with the violent ritual they were performing, and so the man went unnoticed. I didn't need clear vision to perceive how lightning quick his reflexes were. I resisted the urge to blink as he disarmed the man with the knife and cut out his Adam's apple. The other men stood shocked and hesitant to react. When one of them finally dared to retaliate, he found himself face first on the ground with stab wounds up and down his legs, rendered incapable of walking. The third man had clearly gone into a state of shock. He attempted to flee toward the stairs, but the naked man caught him quickly and viciously carved at his face. I couldn't fathom what was going on. My wife was whimpering still, but had as full a view to what was happening as I did. The naked man stood to his feet, covered in blood and clenching the knife. He approached me slowly, turning me onto my back to face him. I could see now that he hardly looked human at all. His arms and legs were covered in what must have been years' worth of exposure to dirt, and his eyes glowed like a cat's in the dark. I attempted again to wipe my eyes when he held out his hand. He was grasping the blade of the knife now, and toward me he pointed the hilt. I accepted. He lifted me to my feet and directed me toward the second man, who he had rendered unable to walk.
"No, please,"
he said, visibly trembling. Those words meant as much to me then as they did to him just a few minutes before. I won't say here what happened next. I can't. But the next morning, after a lot of deliberation, the police and several ambulances escorted 3 corpses from the property. My wife and I are blessed. We shouldn't be alive, and yet here we are a year later. She's pregnant now, and we can't wait for our family to grow from 3 to 4. I still don't know much about the man under my house. He respects our space, and we respect his. What we do know now is that he loves fried food. There's not much you can do to say thank you to someone who saved the life of your entire family, but I think that a bucket of fried chicken every night is a good start. From our family to yours, stay safe.